The dust from the trail still clung to Katherine Reynolds's skirts as she stood at the post office counter in Jordan Valley, Oregon, her hands trembling as she sealed the envelope with wax. She had written and rewritten the letter 17 times over the past 3 days, each attempt bringing her closer to the words she needed to say, though none felt adequate for what her heart truly wanted to express. Will this reach him? Katherine asked the postmaster, an elderly man named Mr. Hendricks, who had seen countless letters pass through his weathered hands since the post office opened in 1864. "If he is where you say he is, miss, it will take about a week," Mr. Hendricks replied, adjusting his spectacles as he examined the address she had written in careful script. "The railroad has made things faster, but once you get into the high country, it is still horseback and determination." Katherine nodded, pressing a few coins into his palm. The year was 1883, and the West was slowly losing its wildness to the march of civilization, but in places like the ranching territory where Preston Quinn worked, time moved at the pace of cattle drives and seasonal roundups. She had met him only 6 weeks ago when her father's wagon wheel broke outside of town, and Preston had been the one to help them, spending 3 hours under the brutal July sun fixing it, while making easy conversation that never felt forced or uncomfortable. She had thought about him every day since, the way his hands moved with such certainty and skill, the kindness in his blue eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, how he had refused payment but accepted her offer of fresh bread and jam, sitting on the tailgate of their wagon and talking with her about everything from the changing seasons to his dreams of having his own spread someday. "Thank you," Katherine said quietly, turning to leave the post office. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped into the afternoon heat. Jordan Valley was small, barely more than a cluster of buildings serving the surrounding ranches and farms, but it had become home over the past year since her family had moved from Sacramento. Her father worked as a farrier, and her mother took in sewing. Katherine helped with both, her days filled with the practical demands of frontier life. What she had not written in the letter was that her father had received an offer to move to Portland. Better opportunities, he said. More people meant more horses, more work, a chance to establish a real business instead of scraping by. They would be leaving in 2 weeks. What she had written was simpler, more direct. She told Preston that meeting him had been the brightest part of her summer, that she found herself looking for him whenever she came to town, that if he felt even a fraction of what she felt, she needed to know before it was too late. She signed it with words that had taken all her courage to commit to paper, with hope and affection, Katherine Reynolds. 3 days later, Preston Quinn rode into the line camp where he had been working the summer range, exhausted from helping move 200 head of cattle to higher pasture. His horse was lathered, and his own clothes were stiff with dried sweat and dust. All he wanted was to wash in the creek, eat something that was not hardtack or beans, and sleep for 12 hours straight. "Letter came for you," called out James Dalton, one of the other cowboys who had stayed behind to watch the camp. "Ryder brought it up yesterday, said it was marked urgent." Preston felt his heart skip. He received letters so rarely that each one was an event. His mother wrote twice a year from Kansas, and he had a sister in Denver who occasionally sent news. He took the envelope from James, recognizing neither the handwriting nor the return address at first. Then he saw the name, Katherine Reynolds, Jordan Valley. His hands went still. Katherine, the woman with the warm brown eyes and quick laugh who had occupied his thoughts far more than was probably healthy for a man who spent most of his time alone with cattle and sagebrush. He had helped her family with that wheel, and spent the next week kicking himself for not asking if he could call on her properly. By the time he got back to Jordan Valley for supplies 3 weeks later, he had worked himself into enough courage to find out where she lived, but his boss had needed him back at camp immediately for the drive. Preston opened the letter carefully, conscious of his dirty hands marking the clean paper. As he read, his world seemed to narrow to just those words. She had been thinking of him. She wanted to know if he felt the same. The letter was dated 5 days ago. "I need to go to Jordan Valley," Preston said, looking up at James. "Now, boss wants us to start working that north section tomorrow. We have got orders." "I know." Preston read the letter again, catching the subtle urgency beneath the carefully chosen words. Something in the way she wrote made him feel like time was running out. "I need to go anyway." James shook his head but did not argue. "That is 3 days hard riding from here. You just got back." "I know that too." Preston was already moving toward his saddlebags, pulling out a clean shirt and his better vest. He would wash quickly, change, and leave before sunset. If he pushed through, rotating between a walk and a steady lope, resting only when his horse absolutely needed it, he could make Jordan Valley in 3 days. "You are crazy," James said, but he was grinning. "Must be some woman." "She is," Preston replied, and realized as he said it how true it was. He barely knew Katherine, but what he did know had lodged itself firmly in his chest. She was clever and capable, unafraid of hard work, but still gentle in her manner. She had a way of looking at the world that made him want to show her everything beautiful in it. When he was fixing that wheel, she had sat nearby and talked with him like he was worth her time, not just some ranch hand doing a favor. Preston spent 20 minutes at the creek, scrubbing off the worst of the grime and changing into fresh clothes. He checked his horse's hooves, applied salve to a small rub on the animal's withers, and made sure his tack was in good condition. The gelding was tired but sound. They would need to pace themselves carefully. He left camp as the sun touched the western hills, carrying jerky, hardtack, and a canteen of water. The route to Jordan Valley would take him through high desert country, past ranches scattered across the landscape like seeds thrown by a careless hand. He knew the way but had never traveled it at this pace, with this sense of purpose pushing him forward. The first night he stopped only when his horse began to stumble with exhaustion. Preston made a cold camp beneath a stand of juniper trees, letting his gelding graze on the sparse grass while he chewed mechanically on jerky and reread Katherine's letter by moonlight. Her handwriting was neat and precise, with small flourishes on the capital letters that suggested someone who had been taught properly but added her own style. He tried to imagine her writing it, sitting at a desk or table, choosing each word with care, with hope and affection. The phrase made his chest tight. It was not a declaration of love, but it was an opening, an invitation, a chance. Preston slept for 4 hours, then saddled up again before dawn. His body protested, stiff and sore from the previous day's work and the hard ground, but he pushed through it. The horse moved with steady determination, as though sensing his rider's urgency. They covered ground through the rising heat of the morning, stopped to water at a creek around midday, then continued through the afternoon. The second day blurred into the rhythm of riding. Preston's world narrowed to the movement of his horse, the landscape passing by, and the constant awareness of Katherine waiting at the other end of this journey. He thought about what he would say to her. Words had never been his strength. He was better with his hands, with action, with showing rather than telling. But she had put herself forward in that letter, taken the risk of rejection, and she deserved more than awkward silence in return. That night, he allowed himself a small fire, more for morale than warmth. He heated water for coffee and sat watching the flames while his horse rested nearby. His mind kept returning to the moment he had first seen Katherine. She had been standing beside the broken wagon, one hand shading her eyes against the sun, and when he rode up she had smiled at him with such genuine relief and friendliness that he had felt it like a physical warmth. "Can you help us?" she had asked. "I am afraid we are thoroughly stuck." He had helped them, and in those 3 hours he had learned that she was 20 years old, that she loved to read but rarely had access to new books, that she had strong opinions about everything from politics to pie, and that she found humor in situations that might have left others frustrated. When he finished the repair, and she offered him that bread and jam, they had talked for another hour until her father came back from where he had been checking on something in town. Preston had ridden away that day feeling like he had left something important behind, but he had not known how to go back for it. Now Katherine had given him the reason. The third day dawned gray and windy. Clouds gathered on the horizon, and Preston could smell rain in the air. He pushed his horse a little harder, wanting to reach Jordan Valley before any storm broke. His gelding responded gamely despite the long miles, perhaps sensing that they were nearing journey's end. They rode through country that grew gradually more settled. Preston passed homesteads where families were proving up claims, saw fields of wheat rippling in the wind, crossed paths with a freight wagon heading in the opposite direction. Jordan Valley lay in a valley carved by the Awahi River, and as he descended from the higher ground, he felt anticipation building in his chest until it was hard to breathe normally. He reached town in late afternoon of the third day. Dust covered him from hat to boots, and his horse walked with its head low from exhaustion. Preston went first to the livery stable, where he paid for his gelding to be rubbed down, fed, and given a proper stall. Only then did he allow himself to think about finding Katherine. The town was quiet in the way of small settlements in the afternoon heat. A few people moved along the single main street, conducting business or running errands. Preston stood for a moment, suddenly uncertain. He had ridden 3 days to get here, but he did not actually know where Katherine lived. He had her letter, with a return address that listed Jordan Valley but no specific location beyond that. The post office seemed like the logical place to start. Preston walked through the door, the bell chiming overhead, and found Mr. Hendricks sorting mail behind the counter. "Help you?" the postmaster asked, looking up. "I am looking for Katherine Reynolds," Preston said. "I received a letter from her and I need to speak with her." Mr. Hendricks studied him for a long moment, taking in the trail dust and obvious weariness. "You would be Preston Quinn, then?" "Yes, sir." The older man's expression softened slightly. "She has been coming in here every day asking if there was any reply, seemed quite anxious about it." Hope surged through Preston's chest. "Can you tell me where to find her? Reynolds' place is about a mile north of town. You will see a sign for farrier work. Cannot miss it." Mr. Hendricks paused, then added, "She is a good girl, kind family." "Thank you," Preston said, already turning toward the door. "Young man," Mr. Hendricks called out. Preston stopped. "You might want to clean up a bit first. There is a pump behind the general store." Preston looked down at himself and realized the postmaster was right. He was filthy, exhausted, and probably did not smell particularly good. This was not how he wanted Katherine to see him after riding 3 days to get here. He nodded his thanks and headed for the general store. The pump water was cold and shocking. Preston stripped off his shirt and washed his face, neck, and arms, scrubbing away the accumulated dust and sweat. He ran wet hands through his hair, smoothing it back, then put on his cleanest shirt from his saddlebag. It was not much, but it was better than appearing on her doorstep looking like he had just crawled out of a ditch. His heart hammered as he walked north out of town. The mile felt both too long and too short. He rehearsed things to say in his mind, but they all sounded either too formal or too casual, too presumptuous or too hesitant. Finally, he decided he would just tell her the truth, that he received her letter, that he came as soon as he could, and that everything she wondered about in that letter was yes. The Reynolds place materialized out of the heat shimmer. It was a modest homestead with a house, a barn, and a separate workshop where Mr. Reynolds presumably did his farrier work. Preston could see a small vegetable garden and a chicken coop. Clothes hung on a line, moving slightly in the breeze. Smoke rose from the chimney despite the heat, suggesting Mrs. Reynolds was cooking. Preston approached the house, his mouth dry. Before he could knock, the door opened and Katherine stood there, as though she had been watching from the window. For a moment they just looked at each other. She was exactly as he remembered. Dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, brown eyes that seemed to hold both intelligence and warmth, a dusting of freckles across her nose that suggested she spent time in the sun. She wore a simple dress of faded blue calico, an apron tied around her waist. Her hands, he noticed, bore small calluses from hard work. "Preston," she said, and his name on her lips was the sweetest sound he had heard in months. "I got your letter," he said. "I came as soon as I could. You came." She looked stunned, as though she had not quite believed he would. "You rode all the way here." "3 days," he confirmed. "I left the same evening the letter reached me. I would have come sooner, but I was at the high camp and the letter took time to get to me." Katherine's eyes were bright, and he realized she was fighting tears. "I was not sure you would. I thought maybe I was being foolish, presuming too much." "You were not presuming," Preston said. The words came easier now, facing her, seeing the vulnerability in her expression. "I have thought about you every day since I helped with your wagon. I wanted to come back sooner, wanted to ask if I could call on you properly, but work kept me away and I thought maybe you had forgotten about me." "I could not forget you," Katherine said softly. "I tried. It seemed impractical to think about a cowboy I met once on the road. But I kept remembering the way you talked to me like I was someone worth listening to, the way you smiled, how gentle you were with our horse while you worked." Preston took a step closer. They were standing on her front porch, barely 2 feet apart, and the air between them felt charged with possibility. "Your letter said you needed to know before it was too late." "What did you mean?" Katherine's expression changed, happiness mixing with distress. "My father received an offer to work in Portland. Better opportunities, more steady income. We are supposed to leave in less than 2 weeks. I wrote to you because I could not bear the thought of leaving without knowing if what I felt was just in my imagination." The words hit Preston like a physical blow. 2 weeks. He had made it here in time, but barely. "Do you want to go to Portland?" "I want what is best for my family," Katherine said carefully. "My parents have worked so hard to build a life here, and if Portland offers them something better, I cannot stand in the way of that." "That was not what I asked." Preston held her gaze. "Do you want to go?" Katherine bit her lip, then shook her head. "No. I have finally started to feel at home here. I have friends, a life that feels like mine. And now there is you, or at least the possibility of you, and I do not want to leave that behind before I even know what it could be." "Then do not go," Preston said. "It is not that simple. It could be." Preston reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. Her fingers were cool despite the heat, and they curled around his with a trust that made his chest ache. "Katherine, I rode 3 days just to read your letter, to see you, to tell you that everything you felt, I felt too. I do not have much to offer right now. I am just a ranch hand who earns wages and saves what he can. But I am a hard worker, and I have skills that are valuable out here. I can build a life, build something real if I have a reason to." "Preston," Katherine breathed. "I am saying this badly," he continued, "but what I mean is that you are that reason. You could be that reason if you wanted." If your parents will not stay, if they are determined to go to Portland, then stay here. Marry me. Let me prove that I can give you a good life." Catherine's eyes widened. "You are proposing marriage. We barely know each other." "I know enough," Preston said. "I know you are kind and smart and brave enough to write that letter. I know that when I am around you, the world feels more right than it does any other time. I know that I rode 3 days without stopping to get here because the thought of missing my chance with you was unbearable. That is enough for me. The rest we can learn together." Tears spilled down Catherine's cheeks now, but she was smiling. "This is crazy. This is the most impractical, reckless thing I have ever considered." "Is that a no?" "No," Katherine said, then laughed. "I mean, it is not a no, I mean yes." "Yes, Preston Quinn, I will marry you." The joy that flooded through Preston was so intense it was almost painful. He squeezed her hand, then pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her in a hug that lifted her slightly off her feet. She laughed against his shoulder, her arms coming up around his neck. "This is insane," she murmured, but she was holding him just as tightly. "Maybe," Preston agreed, "but it feels right." They stood like that for a long moment until the sound of someone clearing their throat made them break apart. Catherine's father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Mr. Reynolds," Preston said, taking a respectful step back, "I apologize for the impropriety." "I heard what you said to my daughter," Mr. Reynolds replied. His voice was stern, but his eyes were not unkind. "That is a bold proposal for a man who just rode into town." "Yes, sir. I do not mean any disrespect to you or your family. I care about Katherine, and I want to do right by her." Mr. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "You are the cowboy who fixed our wheel back in July. I remember you. You did good work and would not take more than bread for payment." "That is right, sir. And now you want to marry my daughter." "Yes, sir, if you will give your blessing." Catherine's father sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He suddenly looked very tired. "Come inside. All of us should talk about this properly. Mary," he called into the house, "we have a guest and a situation that needs discussing." Catherine's mother appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a plump woman with graying hair and Catherine's same warm eyes. She looked between Preston and her daughter, taking in their clasped hands and flushed faces, and her expression softened with understanding. "I see," Mrs. Reynolds said. "Well then, young man, you had better come in and tell us about yourself." The next 2 hours were some of the most nerve-wracking of Preston's life. He sat at the Reynolds' kitchen table, drinking coffee and answering a barrage of questions from Catherine's parents. Where was he from? What was his family like? What were his prospects? What kind of life could he provide for their daughter? Preston answered honestly. He told them about growing up on a farm in Kansas, learning to work with horses and cattle from a young age. How his father died when Preston was 16, and he had worked various ranch jobs to help support his mother and sister until they were settled. How he had come west 5 years ago looking for opportunities, and had been working steadily ever since, building his skills and his savings. "I have $400 saved," Preston said. "I know that is not a fortune, but it is enough to start with. I have been planning to look for my own place soon, maybe lease some land and start building a small herd. With Katherine, I would work twice as hard to make that happen." $400 is not nothing, Mr. Reynolds admitted. "That shows discipline and planning. But ranching is uncertain work, especially starting out. There are droughts, hard winters, cattle die, prices drop. I know the risks, sir, but I also know I am good at what I do. I can work with horses, cattle, I can break broncs, I know range management. If ranching does not work out right away, I can always hire on for wages until it does." Mrs. Reynolds had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now she spoke up. "What about Katherine? Have you thought about what her life would be like? Married to a man who is gone for weeks at a time working cattle, living in rough conditions while you build your place. Preston looked at Katherine, who sat beside him at the table. I have thought about it. I will not lie and say it will be easy, especially at first, but I will work to make it better as fast as I can, and I will never leave her wondering if she matters to me. She will always come first. Katherine, her father said, you have barely said anything. This is your life we are discussing. What do you think about all this? Katherine took a deep breath. Preston could see her gathering her courage. I think Preston is offering me something real. Yes, it might be hard at first. Yes, there is risk. But there is risk in everything, is there not? We could go to Portland and find that the opportunities there are not what we hoped. We could stay here and struggle just as much. At least with Preston, I would be building something with someone I choose, someone who sees me as a partner. You barely know him, her mother said gently. I know enough, Katherine replied, echoing Preston's words from earlier. I know he is honest and hardworking. I know he treated us with kindness when he had no reason to do us favors. I know he rode 3 days just to answer my letter. And I know that when I am with him, I feel like myself, only better. Her parents exchanged a long look, one of those wordless conversations that long married couples could have. Finally, Mr. Reynolds sighed. I cannot say I am entirely comfortable with this, he said. It is happening very fast, but I also remember being young and feeling like time was running out. Your mother and I married after knowing each other for 6 weeks, and we have made it work for 23 years now. Robert, Mrs. Reynolds said, touching her husband's arm. There was a question in her voice. If this is what Katherine wants, Mr. Reynolds said slowly, then I will not stand in the way, but I have conditions. Anything, sir, Preston said immediately. You will marry her properly with a ceremony and witnesses. Not some rushed affair that people will gossip about, of course. You will write to us regularly so we know she is safe and cared for. I promise. And if at any time in the first year things are not working out, if Katherine is unhappy, or if you cannot provide for her properly, you will send her to us in Portland, and we will welcome her home with no judgment or questions asked. That stung a little, the implication that Preston might fail, but he understood it. These were parents protecting their daughter. I agree to that, sir, though I do not think it will come to that. Mr. Reynolds stood and extended his hand. Then you have my blessing, Preston Quinn. Take care of my daughter. Preston shook his hand firmly. I will, sir, I swear it. Mrs. Reynolds was crying now, dabbing at her eyes with her apron. My baby is getting married. I never thought it would happen so fast. She came around the table and hugged Katherine tightly. Are you sure about this, sweetheart? Truly sure. I am, Mama, Katherine said, returning the embrace. I know it seems sudden, but it feels right. It feels like what I am supposed to do. Then I am happy for you, Mrs. Reynolds said, though her voice shook. She turned to Preston. You seem like a good man. Please prove me right about that. I will do everything in my power to, Preston promised. The practicalities came next. Katherine's parents were due to leave for Portland in 12 days. That gave them less than 2 weeks to arrange everything. Mrs. Reynolds immediately began planning, talking about Katherine's dress, the ceremony, what food they would serve. Mr. Reynolds was more concerned with legal matters, making sure the marriage would be properly registered, and that Katherine would have claim to anything Preston owned. Preston listened to it all with a sense of unreality. This morning he had been riding hard toward Jordan Valley, hoping only for a chance to speak with Katherine, to tell her he shared her feelings. Now, as the sun set and evening shadows filled the Reynolds kitchen, he was planning a wedding. Katherine seemed equally overwhelmed. When her mother went to check on the dinner she had been cooking and her father stepped outside to do evening chores, she turned to Preston with wide eyes. "This is really happening," she said. "It is," Preston agreed, having second thoughts. "No, maybe." "I do not know," Katherine laughed shakily. "I feel like I am standing on the edge of a cliff about to jump, and I do not know if I will fall or fly." Preston took her hand again. "We will figure it out together, and for what it is worth, I am just as scared as you are. You do not seem scared." "I am terrified," Preston admitted. "I rode here thinking I would just tell you I cared about you, maybe ask if I could court you properly. I did not plan to propose marriage within an hour of arriving. But when you said you were leaving, when I thought about losing you before we even had a chance, the words just came out. And now that they are out there, I do not want to take them back." "I do not want you to," Katherine said softly. "I am scared, but I am also more excited than I have been about anything in years. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense." They sat together at the table, hands clasped, talking quietly while the house settled into evening routines around them. Mrs. Reynolds called them to dinner eventually, and Preston ate with the family, answering more questions and learning more about them in turn. He learned that Katherine had a younger brother who had died of fever when he was 6, that Mrs. Reynolds had been a teacher before she married, that Mr. Reynolds had learned his trade from his father, continuing a family skill that went back generations. As the evening wore on, Preston realized he needed to find somewhere to stay. He mentioned it reluctantly, not wanting to leave Katherine's presence but knowing it would not be proper to remain too late. "You can stay in the barn if you like," Mr. Reynolds offered. "It is clean and dry, and there is spare bedding. Save you the cost of the boarding house in town." Preston accepted gratefully. When he stepped outside to get his saddlebags from where he had left them by the porch, Katherine followed him. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "Thank you for riding all that way just for me." "I would have ridden a lot farther," Preston said. He wanted to kiss her but was acutely aware of her father watching from the window. Instead, he squeezed her hand. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we start planning our future." Katherine smiled, and even in the dim light from the house he could see the joy in her expression. "Our future. I like the sound of that." Preston slept that night in the Reynolds barn, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls and the mice rustling in the hay. Despite his exhaustion from 3 days of hard riding, sleep was long in coming. His mind spun with everything that had happened, everything that would need to happen in the coming days. He had come here with nothing but hope and a letter. Now he was engaged to be married, had promises to keep, and a life to build. The magnitude of it was almost crushing, but underneath the fear was a bedrock of certainty. Katherine was worth it. Whatever challenges they faced, they would face together, and that made all the difference. The next morning, Preston woke to the sound of roosters crowing and Mr. Reynolds doing his morning chores. He washed at the pump, changed into fresh clothes, and went to the house where Mrs. Reynolds was making breakfast. Katherine was already up, her hair neatly braided, wearing a different dress than yesterday. She smiled when she saw him and Preston felt his heart skip. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. Everything felt both strange and wonderful. Yesterday he had been alone. Today he had Katherine, her smile, the promise of a shared future. Over breakfast, they made plans. Preston needed to get back to the ranch where he worked, to give notice and collect his wages. That would take several days. In the meantime, Katherine and her mother would work on her dress and make arrangements for the ceremony. Mr. Reynolds said he would handle the legal paperwork and talk to the local minister about performing the service. "How long will you be gone?" Katherine asked Preston. 4 days, maybe 5. I need to ride back, settle things with my boss, and ride back here again. I will push as hard as I can." Do not push so hard you hurt yourself or your horse, Katherine said firmly. A few extra days will not matter in the grand scheme of things. Preston appreciated her practicality. It was one of the many things he was learning to love about her. She was not some delicate flower who needed constant protection. She understood the realities of frontier life and accepted them without complaint. He left after breakfast, riding back toward the high country where his job waited. This time the journey felt different. He was not rushing towards something but already carrying it with him. Catherine's face stayed clear in his mind. Her voice, her laugh, the way she looked at him like he was someone important. When Preston reached the cow camp, James took one look at him and started laughing. "You have got that look." "What look?" "The look of a man who just got himself engaged. Did she say yes?" "She did," Preston confirmed, unable to keep the grin off his face. "Well, congratulations, you crazy fool. When is the wedding?" "9 days from now. I need to give notice and collect my pay." James whistled. "Boss is not going to be happy about losing you right before the fall gather." He was right. The ranch foreman, a grizzled man named Sullivan, scowled when Preston explained the situation. "Marriage? Now? Could you not have waited until after the season?" "No, sir, I could not. Her family is moving to Portland, and if I do not marry her now, I lose her." Sullivan grumbled but ultimately accepted it. Preston was a good worker, and there was no shortage of cowboys looking for jobs. Sullivan agreed to pay out Preston's wages through the end of the month, along with a small bonus for the work he had already done this season. "You are making a mistake, getting married this young," Sullivan said as he counted out the money. "Should be sowing your wild oats, not tying yourself down." "I do not see it as tying myself down," Preston replied. "I see it as building something real." "Your funeral," Sullivan said, but his expression was not unkind. "Good luck, Quinn. You will need it." Preston spent 2 days finishing up his work and gathering his possessions. He did not own much. Clothes, tack, a good saddle, his father's pocket watch, a rifle, and a few books he had collected over the years. Everything fit into his saddlebags and a bedroll. It was a sparse collection for a man of 24, but Preston had always preferred to travel light, to stay mobile in case better opportunities arose elsewhere. Now those priorities were changing. He needed to think about establishing roots, building a home, creating stability. It was both exciting and daunting. He said goodbye to the few friends he had made among the ranch crew, accepted their ribbing and congratulations in equal measure, and rode out early on the 3rd morning. The journey back to Jordan Valley felt longer this time, maybe because he was not driven by the same urgent need. But anticipation still pulled at him. Each mile brought him closer to Katherine, to their wedding, to the start of their life together. He arrived back in Jordan Valley in the late afternoon of the 5th day. Preston went immediately to the Reynolds place, where he found organized chaos. Mrs. Reynolds was sewing frantically, surrounded by fabric and thread. Mr. Reynolds was building something in his workshop that looked like it might be a hope chest. Katherine was in the garden, harvesting vegetables, but she looked up when she heard his horse and her whole face lit up. "You are back," she said, setting down her basket and hurrying over. "I said I would be," Preston replied, dismounting. He wanted to hug her, to hold her close, but they were in full view of her parents and he settled for taking her hands. "How have things been here?" "Busy. Mama has been working on my dress day and night. Papa has been building furniture for us to take with us, wherever we end up. And I have been trying to figure out how to pack a life into a wagon." "About that," Preston said, "I have been thinking. I have $420 now with my final wages. That is enough to lease some land, maybe buy a small starter herd, but we will need somewhere to live while we build. I was thinking we could find a small house to rent in town, just temporarily, while I scout for the right property. Katherine nodded. That makes sense. We will need to be practical, especially at first. I know it is not much of a honeymoon, jumping straight into work and worry. I do not need a honeymoon, Katherine said. I just need you and a chance to build something together. That is enough. Preston squeezed her hands. You are remarkable. You know that, she smiled. I am practical. There is a difference. The next 4 days were a blur of preparation. Preston helped Mr. Reynolds with various projects, learning more about the man who would soon be his father-in-law. Mr. Reynolds was quiet but thoughtful, with strong opinions and a dry sense of humor that Preston appreciated. They worked well together, and Preston could tell that Mr. Reynolds was warming to him, seeing that he was genuinely committed to making Katherine happy. Mrs. Reynolds was harder to read. She was kind to Preston but often looked sad, and he realized she was mourning the loss of her daughter even as she prepared for the wedding. Katherine was her only surviving child, and Mrs. Reynolds had probably imagined being more involved in her daughter's life, especially once grandchildren came along. Instead, Katherine would be staying in Oregon while her parents moved to Portland, separated by several days of difficult travel. Preston found a moment alone with Mrs. Reynolds 3 days before the wedding. She was sitting on the porch, mending something, and he sat down beside her. Mrs. Reynolds, he said, I want you to know that I understand what you are giving up, what you are trusting me with. Katherine is precious to you, and I promise I will do everything I can to be worthy of that trust. Mrs. Reynolds set down her mending and looked at him with eyes that were suspiciously bright. You are a good man, Preston. I can see that. But she is my baby, my only child now, and I am giving her to you when I barely know you. It is hard. I know. If there was more time, if we could do this more slowly, I would prefer that too. But sometimes life does not give us the luxury of time. No, it does not, Mrs. Reynolds wiped at her eyes. Promise me you will write. Promise me you will send word when there are grandchildren. Promise me that if you two are ever in Portland, you will come see us. I promise all of that, Preston said. And I promise that if you ever want to come visit, we will always have room for you no matter how small our place is. Mrs. Reynolds hugged him then, suddenly and tightly. Take care of her. She acts so strong, but she has a tender heart. I will, Preston promised. The wedding was set for Saturday, 4 days before Katherine's parents were due to leave for Portland. The local minister, Reverend Hawthorne, agreed to perform the ceremony at the small church in town. Mrs. Reynolds had finished Katherine's dress, a simple but elegant gown of cream-colored linen with lace at the collar and cuffs. Preston bought a new shirt and vest from the general store, spending more than he had planned, but wanting to look his best. The morning of the wedding, Preston woke in the barn feeling both excited and terrified. This was it. In a few hours, he would be a married man, responsible for another person's happiness and well-being. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, but so was the rightness of it. He dressed carefully, making sure every button was fastened, every crease smooth. He combed his hair and tried to tame the stubborn pieces that always stuck up no matter what he did. He polished his boots until they shined. He checked his reflection in the small mirror Mr. Reynolds had loaned him and barely recognized himself. He looked older, more serious, like a man about to make the most important commitment of his life. Because he was. The church was small, holding maybe 30 people at capacity. Today it held about 15. Katherine's parents, a few neighbors, Mr. Hendricks from the post office, some of the other shopkeepers from town who had gotten to know the Reynolds family over the past year. Preston stood at the front with Reverend Hawthorne, his hands clasped to keep them from shaking. Then Katherine walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and Preston forgot to breathe. She was beautiful. Not in some impossible fairy tale way, but in a real, tangible way that made his heart ache. Her dress fit perfectly, showing her figure while remaining modest. Her hair was arranged in a style more elaborate than her usual practical bun, with small flowers woven through the dark strands. Her face was glowing, a mix of nervousness and joy that Preston suspected mirrored his own expression. When she reached the front, Mr. Reynolds placed Catherine's hand in Preston's. His grip was firm, his eyes serious. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "I will, sir." The ceremony itself was brief. Reverend Hawthorne spoke about the sanctity of marriage, the commitment they were making to each other, the challenges and joys they would face together. Preston barely heard the words. All his attention was on Katherine, on her hand in his, on the way she looked at him with such trust and hope. "Do you, Preston Quinn, take Katherine Reynolds to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Preston said, his voice stronger than he expected. "And do you, Katherine Reynolds, take Preston Quinn to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Katherine said, and her voice did not waver at all. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Oregon, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Preston, you may kiss your bride." Preston had thought about this moment, wondered if it would be awkward with everyone watching. But when he leaned in and Katherine met him halfway, when their lips touched for the first time, everything else fell away. It was gentle and brief, appropriate for the setting, but it held promise. This was just the beginning. The small congregation applauded. Mrs. Reynolds was crying openly now. Mr. Reynolds looked stoic, but Preston could see emotion in his eyes. They signed the marriage register, making it official, and then they were walking back down the aisle together, husband and wife. There was a small reception at the Reynolds house afterward. Mrs. Reynolds had cooked for days, preparing enough food to feed everyone who had come to the wedding and then some. There was roast chicken, fresh bread, vegetables from the garden, 3 different pies. People ate and talked and offered advice to the newlyweds, some of it useful, some of it less so. Preston stayed close to Katherine through it all, acutely aware of the ring on his finger and the matching one on hers. They were simple gold bands, purchased with some of his saved money, but they meant everything. They were a visible symbol of the promise they had made, the life they would build together. As the afternoon wore into evening, guests began to leave. Preston and Katherine had arranged to rent a small house on the edge of town, just 2 rooms and a lean-to, but it was theirs. Mrs. Reynolds had packed a basket of food for them, along with linens and dishes and various household items. Mr. Reynolds had built them a small table and 2 chairs as a wedding gift. "Are you ready to go home?" Preston asked Katherine when they finally had a moment alone. "Home," Katherine repeated, as though testing out the word. "Yes, I am ready." They said goodbye to her parents, a long and emotional process that involved a lot of hugging and last-minute advice and reminders to write. Then they walked together through the twilight toward their rented house, Preston carrying their bags and Katherine carrying the basket. The house was simple but clean. Someone, probably Katherine's mother, had been there earlier to set things up. There was wood stacked by the fireplace, a lamp lit on the table, their wedding gifts arranged neatly. It was not much, but it felt like possibility. "So," Katherine said, setting down the basket, "here we are." "Here we are," Preston agreed. Now that they were alone, a new kind of nervousness settled over him. They were married now. This was their wedding night. There were expectations, implications, and he suddenly felt very young and inexperienced. Katherine seemed to sense his uncertainty. She crossed the small room and took his hands. "We do not have to figure everything out tonight," she said gently. "We have time." "I want you to be happy," Preston said. "I want to be a good husband." "You already are," Katherine replied. "You rode 3 days to see me. You proposed marriage so I would not have to leave. You have been kind and patient with my parents. Those are not small things, Preston." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. She fit perfectly against him, her head tucked under his chin. "I was so scared when I read your letter," he admitted. "Scared that I had waited too long, that you would slip away before I could tell you how I felt." "I was scared too," Katherine said. "Scared that I had been foolish, reading too much into one afternoon of conversation. Scared that you would not come, or that you would come and tell me gently that you did not feel the same way." "I could never tell you that," Preston said. "From the moment I met you, you have been in my head and my heart. I tried to convince myself it was just attraction, just loneliness, but it was more than that. You made me want to be better, to build something lasting." Katherine pulled back enough to look up at him. "Kiss me again," she said. "Like you did at the church, but more." Preston did. This kiss was longer, deeper, filled with all the things he did not have words for. Katherine responded with equal passion, her arms coming up around his neck, her body pressing against his. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "That was nice," Katherine said, her voice a little shaky. "Very nice," Preston agreed. They spent their wedding night learning each other, talking and touching and discovering what it meant to be married. There was awkwardness and uncertainty, but there was also tenderness and growing confidence. By the time they fell asleep in the small bed, tangled together under a quilt Katherine's mother had made, Preston felt like he had found something he had been searching for his whole life without knowing it. The next morning brought reality crashing back. Preston needed to find work, real work that would allow him to support Katherine while also saving toward his dream of having his own place. Katherine needed to finish helping her parents prepare for their move to Portland. They had 4 days before Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds would leave, and Preston knew those days would be precious for Katherine. "Go spend time with them," Preston said over breakfast. "I will start asking around about work opportunities." "Are you sure?" Katherine asked. "I am sure. They are leaving soon, and you will not have another chance to see them for a long time. Make the most of it." Katherine kissed him gratefully. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You wrote a letter," Preston replied with a smile. "And you took a chance on a cowboy who was probably half crazy for proposing marriage after knowing you for barely any time at all." "We were both half crazy," Katherine said, "but I think it was the good kind of crazy." Preston spent that day and the next talking to people in town and at the surrounding ranches. Work was available, but much of it involved being away for extended periods during roundups and drives. He wanted something that would allow him to come home to Katherine regularly, at least until they were more established. He finally found an opportunity at her ranch about 5 miles from town. The owner, a man named Walter Pierce, needed someone to help break and train horses. The work would be fairly steady, based at the ranch rather than out on the range, and Pierce was willing to pay decent wages. It was not exactly what Preston had dreamed of, but it was a solid start. "When can you begin?" Pierce asked. "My wife's parents are leaving for Portland in 3 days. I would like to see them off, then I can start the day after that." "Fair enough. You have got yourself a job, Quinn." Preston rode home to tell Katherine the good news. She was at her parents' place helping her mother pack. When she heard about the job, she hugged him tightly. "That is wonderful," she said. "Training horses is good work, and 5 miles is close enough that you can come home regularly." "It is not ranching," Preston said. Not yet. It is a step toward ranching, Katherine replied, and it is honest work that will pay our bills. That is enough for now. The next 3 days passed too quickly. Preston divided his time between helping the Reynolds family finish their preparations and setting up his own household with Katherine. They bought basic supplies from the general store: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, beans, lard. Katherine borrowed canning equipment from a neighbor and began putting up vegetables from her mother's garden to see them through the winter. In the evenings, Preston and Katherine would return to their small house, exhausted from the day's work, and collapse into each other's arms. They talked about everything: their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. Preston learned that Katherine wanted children someday but was in no rush, that she loved to read and had ambitions of teaching if the opportunity ever arose, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but would never admit it to anyone else. Katherine learned that Preston had nightmares sometimes about his father's death, that he was surprisingly good at cooking but terrible at sewing, that he wanted at least 5 children and a ranch large enough to give each of them a good start in life. That underneath his quiet exterior was a deep well of feeling that he did not always know how to express in words. They learned each other's bodies too, discovering what brought pleasure and comfort. It was new territory for both of them, occasionally awkward but increasingly tender. Preston marveled at Katherine's willingness to be vulnerable with him, to trust him with her body and her heart. It made him all the more determined to prove worthy of that trust. The day Katherine's parents were set to leave dawned gray and cool, with a hint of autumn in the air even though it was still summer. The wagon was packed, their possessions loaded carefully to maximize space. Mr. Reynolds had sold his farrier equipment to another blacksmith in town, keeping only his most essential tools. Mrs. Reynolds had given away much of what she had accumulated over years of homemaking, keeping only what was practical or held deep sentimental value. They said their goodbyes at dawn, wanting to get an early start on the long journey to Portland. Mrs. Reynolds clung to Katherine, both women crying. Mr. Reynolds shook Preston's hand with a grip that conveyed both trust and warning. "You take care of her," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I will, sir, I promise. And you write to us. Let us know how you are both doing." "We will," Katherine assured him through her tears, "as often as we can." "If you need anything at all, you let us know," Mrs. Reynolds said. "We may be in Portland, but you are still our daughter, Katherine. That does not change." "I know, Mama. I love you both so much." More hugs, more tears, more last-minute reminders and advice. Then Mr. Reynolds climbed up onto the wagon seat and Mrs. Reynolds settled beside him. He clicked to the horses, and the wagon began to roll forward. Preston and Katherine stood together, watching until the wagon disappeared into the distance. Katherine was shaking with suppressed sobs, and Preston held her close, letting her cry against his shoulder. "They are really gone," she said eventually, her voice muffled. "They are, but they will be fine. Your father is capable, and Portland will offer them good opportunities." "I know. I just feel like I have lost something important." "You have," Preston said honestly. "But you have also gained something. You have a husband who loves you. You have a home, even if it is small right now. You have a future full of possibilities. That counts for something." Katherine pulled back and wiped her eyes. "You are right. I am being foolish crying like this." "You are not being foolish. You are being human. It is okay to be sad about this, Katherine. You do not have to pretend to be strong all the time." She managed a watery smile. "What did I do to deserve you? You keep asking that," Preston said, touching her cheek gently. "The answer is simple. You were yourself, and that was more than enough." They walked back to their house hand in hand. The town felt different now, knowing that Katherine's parents were truly gone. This was no longer temporary, no longer a trial period. This was their life now, for better or worse. Preston started work the next day at the Pierce Ranch. The work was exactly what he had been told: breaking and training young horses for saddle or harness work. It was demanding physically and required patience and skill, but Preston was good at it. He had grown up working with horses and understood their psychology, knew how to be firm without being cruel, how to build trust and cooperation rather than just forcing obedience. Walter Pierce watched him work with the first few horses and nodded approvingly. "You know what you are doing. Good. I have got 6 more young ones that need training before winter." Preston threw himself into the work, driven by the need to prove himself and to earn enough to support Katherine. He left before dawn each morning and returned after dark, exhausted and smelling of horses. But Katherine always had dinner waiting, and the small house was always clean and welcoming. She never complained about his long hours or his tiredness. Instead, she seemed to understand that this was what building a life looked like: hard work, long days, and the slow accumulation of small successes. A month passed, then 2. Fall arrived in earnest, bringing cooler temperatures and the first frosts. Preston and Katherine settled into the rhythms of married life. They learned how to navigate disagreements without letting them fester into real fights. They learned when to give each other space and when to push through tiredness to connect. They learned that marriage was less about grand romantic gestures and more about showing up every day, choosing each other again and again. Katherine wrote to her parents as promised, long letters detailing their daily life. Mrs. Reynolds wrote back with equal faithfulness, sharing news from Portland and asking questions about everything from Katherine's garden to whether they were attending church regularly. The letters were a lifeline, keeping Katherine connected to her family even across the distance. Preston continued to save every penny he could spare. By the time winter settled in fully, he had added another $150 to their savings. It was progress, but he calculated that they would need at least another year of steady work before they could seriously consider leasing land for their own place. Winter brought new challenges. The small house was drafty, and keeping it warm required constant attention to the fire. Food was more expensive, and they had to be careful with their supplies. Preston's work slowed somewhat since winter was not the ideal time for breaking young horses, which meant his wages decreased. They managed, but there was little room for error or unexpected expenses. In January, Katherine discovered she was pregnant. She told Preston one evening after he came home from work, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "I am going to have a baby," she said. "Sometime in the summer, I think." Preston stared at her, processing the information. A baby, a child. He was going to be a father. The enormity of it hit him like a physical force. "Preston," Katherine said, anxiety creeping into her voice. "Say something." He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. "That is wonderful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Terrifying, but wonderful." "You are not angry." "Angry? Why would I be angry? We are barely managing as it is. A baby will make everything harder." Preston pulled back enough to look at her face. "Katherine, we always knew children would be part of our future. Maybe this is sooner than we planned, but that does not make it any less of a blessing. We will manage. We always do." Relief flooded Katherine's expression. "I was so worried you would think I was careless." "These things happen when people are married," Preston said with a slight smile. "I am pretty sure we both played a part in this." Katherine laughed, some of the tension draining from her body. "I suppose we did." That night, lying in bed with Katherine curled against his side, Preston felt the weight of responsibility settle even more heavily on his shoulders. A baby meant more expenses. doctor visits, baby clothes and supplies, eventually a bigger place to live. Their two-room house would be cramped with 3 people. He needed to work harder, save faster, build their security more quickly. But underneath the worry was joy. He was going to be a father. He and Katherine were creating a family. This was what he had wanted, even if the timing was not perfect. Nothing about their relationship had followed a conventional timeline. Why should this be any different? Preston told Walter Pierce about the pregnancy the next week, explaining that he would need steady work through the spring and summer. "Congratulations," Pierce said. "Babies are expensive. Tell you what, I have been thinking about expanding the horse operation. If you are willing to take on more responsibility, managing the training program instead of just doing it yourself, I can pay you more. You would need to hire and supervise a couple of helpers, keep records, deal with buyers." It was more than Preston had hoped for. The additional responsibility would mean longer hours, but the extra wages would make a real difference. "I will do it. Thank you, sir. You have earned it. You are the best hand with horses I have seen in 20 years. Might as well make use of that." Preston threw himself into his expanded role with fierce determination. He hired 2 younger men to help with the actual training, teaching them his methods and supervising their work. He kept meticulous records of each horse's progress, which buyers appreciated. He learned how to negotiate prices, how to assess a horse's potential market value, how to manage the business side of the operation. The extra wages helped, but Preston also began taking on side jobs in the evenings and on Sundays. He would break horses for individual ranchers, repair tack, do farrier work that he had learned from watching Katherine's father. Every dollar went into their savings or toward preparing for the baby. Katherine, meanwhile, dealt with the physical challenges of pregnancy while continuing to run their household. She suffered from terrible morning sickness in the first few months, but she never complained. She sewed baby clothes from scraps of fabric, washed and rewashed the few items they had managed to buy, prepared their home as best she could for the new arrival. In March, they received a letter from Katherine's mother with wonderful news. The Reynoldses were doing well in Portland. Mr. Reynolds had more work than he could handle, and they had been able to rent a small house near the center of town. Mrs. Reynolds was taking in sewing again and enjoying the busier pace of city life. They were planning to come visit once the baby was born. "Mama wants to come," Katherine said, her face glowing. "She wants to be here to help with the baby." Preston smiled at her happiness. "That is wonderful. We will make sure everything is ready for their visit." As spring turned to summer, Katherine grew round with their child. Preston found himself constantly amazed by the changes in her body, the visible evidence of the life they had created together. He would put his hand on her belly and feel their baby move, and it never stopped feeling like a miracle. In July, on a hot afternoon that reminded Preston of the day he had first met Katherine, she went into labor. Preston rode frantically for the midwife, an experienced woman named Mrs. Potter, who had delivered half the babies in Jordan Valley. She came quickly, bringing her supplies in a calm, competent manner that settled Preston's panic somewhat. "First babies take their time," Mrs. Potter said. "This could be a while. You might want to find something to do besides wearing out the floorboards with pacing." But Preston could not leave. He stayed close, holding Katherine's hand when she needed him, giving her space when she needed that instead. The labor was long and difficult, stretching from afternoon into evening and then deep into the night. Preston had never felt so helpless. Katherine was in pain, working harder than he had ever seen anyone work, and there was nothing he could do to make it easier. Finally, as dawn broke over the valley, their son was born. The midwife cleaned him quickly and placed him in Katherine's arms. Preston stared at the tiny, red-faced creature that was his child and felt his entire world shift. "He is perfect," Katherine whispered, exhausted but radiant. "He is," Preston agreed, his voice choked with emotion. "You are amazing. I cannot believe you just did that." "Women have been doing it for thousands of years," Katherine said with a tired smile. "I am not special." "You are to me," Preston said, leaning down to kiss her forehead gently. "You are everything to me." They named their son Peter after Preston's father. Peter Quinn, born July 19, 1884, weighing approximately 7 pounds and possessing a set of lungs that suggested he would not be a quiet child. The first weeks with a newborn were harder than Preston had imagined. Peter needed to eat constantly, which meant Katherine got very little sleep. He cried at all hours, sometimes for no reason Preston could determine. The small house felt even smaller with a baby in it, and Preston worried constantly about money, about Katherine's exhaustion, about whether they were doing everything right. But there were also moments of pure joy. Holding Peter while he slept, feeling the weight of his son in his arms. Watching Katherine nurse their baby, seeing the fierce love in her eyes. Coming home from work to find them both napping together, peaceful and safe. Katherine's parents came to visit in August as promised. Mrs. Reynolds took over much of the baby care, giving Katherine a chance to rest properly for the first time in weeks. Mr. Reynolds helped Preston with various projects around their small property, and they spent evenings talking about the future. "You have done well," Mr. Reynolds said one night while they sat outside watching the stars. "You are providing for my daughter and grandson. That is no small thing." "I am trying, sir. Some days it feels like I am barely keeping ahead of our needs." "That is how it feels for most men with families. But you are building something, I can see it. You have steady work, a growing reputation, savings set aside. That is more than a lot of people have." Preston nodded, appreciating the encouragement. "I want to get our own place soon. Lease some land, start building a herd. I am tired of working for wages." "Nothing wrong with ambition. But do not rush it. Make sure you are really ready before you take that leap. Having your own place sounds romantic, but it is risky. If you fail, you will lose everything, and now you have a wife and child depending on you." It was good advice, and Preston took it to heart. He had been pushing himself to move faster, achieve more, but maybe patience was the smarter path. Another year of steady work, building their savings further, that would put them in a stronger position. The Reynoldses stayed for 2 weeks, then reluctantly returned to Portland. Katherine cried when they left, but not as desperately as she had when they first departed. She had her own family now, her own life that was separate from her parents even as it remained connected to them. Fall arrived again, marking a full year since Preston had ridden 3 days to read Katherine's letter. So much had changed in that year. They had married, built a home together, welcomed a son. Preston had expanded his responsibilities at work and doubled their savings. Katherine had navigated pregnancy and childbirth and was becoming a confident mother. They were not wealthy. They still lived in a small rented house. They still had to watch every penny. But they had each other, they had Peter, and they had hope for the future. In October, Walter Pierce called Preston into his office with a surprising proposal. "I am getting older," Pierce said without preamble. "My children have no interest in running this ranch. They have all moved to cities, looking for easier lives. I have been thinking about the future, about what happens to this place when I am gone." Preston waited, not sure where this was going. "You have built up the horse program into something profitable," Pierce continued. "You are good with people, good with animals, and you work harder than anyone I have ever employed. How would you feel about a partnership?" Preston felt his heart start to race. "A partnership?" I would maintain majority ownership for now, but you would have a stake in the operation. You would manage the horse side of things entirely, make decisions about buying and selling, hiring, all of it. In return, you would get a percentage of the profits plus your salary. And when I eventually retire or pass on, you would have the option to buy the place outright with favorable terms. It was more than Preston had dreamed of. Not just employment, but actual ownership. A path to having his own place without the enormous risk of starting from nothing. I need to discuss this with my wife, Preston said carefully, but my initial reaction is that I am very interested. Take your time. Talk it over with Katherine. Let me know in a week. Preston rode home that evening with his mind spinning. He found Katherine feeding Peter, and he waited impatiently for her to finish so he could tell her about Pierce's offer. Katherine listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about the terms and what the partnership would mean in practical terms. What percentage of ownership would you have? He mentioned 20% to start, with the option to increase it over time as I buy in further. And when would we receive the profit share? Monthly? Annually? Annually, after the books are settled for the year. Katherine nodded slowly. What are the risks? If the ranch does poorly, we would see less profit, but we would still have the salary, which is secure. The main risk is that we would be tying ourselves to this place long term. If we accepted this offer, we would not be looking for our own separate ranch. This would become our ranch. Is that what you want? Katherine asked. Preston thought about it seriously. When he had imagined having his own place, he had pictured something smaller and entirely his. But Pierce's ranch was a good operation with solid prospects. Partnering with an established business was smarter than starting from scratch, and he liked Pierce, trusted him to deal fairly. I think it is, Preston said. It is not exactly what I pictured, but it is a good opportunity, maybe a better one than what I was hoping for. Then I think you should accept, Katherine said. We came out here to build something, and this is a way to do that with less risk. I am proud of you, Preston. You have worked so hard for this. Preston felt a surge of love for his wife. She was his partner in every sense of the word, thinking through decisions with him, supporting his ambitions while also being realistic about their circumstances. I could not have done any of this without you. You know that, right? We did it together, Katherine said simply. That is what marriage is supposed to be. Preston accepted Pierce's offer. They worked out the details over the next few weeks, with everything formalized in a contract that Preston had a lawyer in town review before signing. He was now part owner of the Pierce Ranch, with responsibilities and authority to match. The profit share that first year was not enormous, but it was enough to make a real difference. Combined with his salary and the side work he continued to do, Preston and Katherine were able to save aggressively. By the time Peter celebrated his first birthday, they had enough money to move out of their cramped rental into a small house on the ranch property that Pierce offered them at a reduced rent. The house was better than their previous place, 3 rooms instead of 2, with a proper kitchen and a bedroom separate from the living space. There was a small barn and a chicken coop, which meant Katherine could keep chickens and they could have fresh eggs daily. Preston built a garden plot for her, and she planted vegetables that would see them through the next winter. Life settled into new rhythms. Preston's days were consumed by ranch work, but now it was work that felt like his own. He had authority to make decisions about the horse program, to implement his ideas, to build something that bore his stamp. The responsibility was heavier, but so were the rewards. Katherine, meanwhile, had become deeply involved in the small community. She organized a lending library among the women in the area, pooling their books so everyone had access to more reading material. She helped with church functions and took meals to families when someone was sick or a baby was born. She was making a place for herself, building connections that would sustain her through the years. Peter grew from a baby into a toddler, then into a small boy with his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick smile. He was endlessly curious about everything, following Preston around when he was home and chattering constantly to Katherine. He loved the horses and would stand at the corral fence for hours watching them, completely absorbed. In the spring of 1886, Katherine discovered she was pregnant again. This time the news brought pure joy without the anxiety that had accompanied their first pregnancy. They were in a better position now, more stable financially, more confident as parents, living in a better house with more space. Their second child, a daughter they named Mary, was born in December. She was smaller than Peter had been, with a cap of dark hair and a serious expression that made everyone who saw her smile. Peter was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to touch her constantly, to help with her care. The years began to pass more quickly, each one bringing growth and change. Preston bought an additional 5% stake in the ranch in 1887, then another 5% in 1889. Pierce was slowly transitioning toward retirement, giving Preston more and more responsibility for running the entire operation, not just the horse program. Katherine gave birth to their third child, another son they named Samuel, in 1888, then a fourth, a daughter named Anna, in 1891. Their house felt full in the best possible way, loud with children's laughter and the constant activity of family life. Preston had never imagined he could be this happy. The work was hard, sometimes overwhelming, but it was his work. The responsibility was heavy, but it was responsibility for his own future, his family's security. And every evening when he came home to find Katherine and their children waiting, he felt grateful for the chance letter and desperate 3-day ride that had brought him to this life. In 1893, Walter Pierce officially retired and sold his remaining shares of the ranch to Preston. It took everything Preston had saved plus a loan from the bank, but suddenly the ranch was his. The Pierce Ranch became the Quinn Ranch, and Preston Quinn went from being a cowboy working for wages to a rancher with his own operation. He was 34 years old, married for 10 years to the woman who had written him a letter that changed everything. They had 4 children, a thriving ranch, and a life built from hard work and the courage to take a chance on each other. On their 10th anniversary, Preston gave Katherine a gift he had been planning for months. It was a leather-bound journal, empty pages waiting to be filled. "What is this for?" Katherine asked, running her hand over the smooth cover. "For your story," Preston said. "Our story. I thought maybe you could write it down, everything that has happened since you left that letter for me at the post, so our children and grandchildren will know someday." Katherine's eyes filled with tears. "That is beautiful, but I do not know if I can write it well enough." "You do not have to write it well, just write it true. Tell them about the girl who took a chance on writing to a cowboy, the man who rode 3 days just to read it, everything that came after." That night, after the children were asleep, Katherine opened the journal and began to write. "The dust from the trail still clung to my skirts as I stood at the post office counter in Jordan Valley, Oregon, my hands trembling as I sealed the envelope with wax." Over the following months and years, she filled the journal with their story, the anxious wait for Preston's response. The 3-day ride that brought him to her door, the whirlwind courtship and marriage, the struggles of their first years together, the birth of each child, the slow building of their ranch and their life. The children grew. Peter showed an aptitude for working with horses that reminded Preston of himself at that age. Mary was quiet and studious, always reading when she could find a book. Samuel was adventurous and fearless, constantly getting into scrapes that left Catherine gray with worry. Anna was the baby, doted on by everyone, with a sunny disposition that brightened the household. In 1895, Catherine's mother passed away suddenly. The news came in a letter from Mr. Reynolds, and Catherine grieved deeply for the loss. Preston held her through the worst of it, understanding that even though she had built a life separate from her parents, the connection remained strong. They made the journey to Portland for the funeral, leaving the children with trusted friends for the week they were gone. Mr. Reynolds looked older and more frail than Preston remembered. The loss of his wife had hit him hard. "I should have come visited more," he said to Catherine as they stood beside Mrs. Reynolds' grave. "I should have made the time to see my grandchildren growing up." "You were building your life, just like we were building ours," Catherine said gently. "Mama understood that. Still, I have regrets." After the funeral, they convinced Mr. Reynolds to come back to Jordan Valley with them for an extended visit. He stayed for 3 months, during which time he taught Peter and Samuel basic blacksmithing and farrier skills. He told stories about Catherine's childhood, about his own life, about the early days of his marriage to Mrs. Reynolds. The children loved having their grandfather around, and Preston could see that Mr. Reynolds drew comfort from being with family during his grief. When Mr. Reynolds finally returned to Portland, he was in better spirits. "You have built something good here," he told Preston before he left. "Take care of them." "Always, sir." The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Preston had a gift for identifying good horses and training them well. The Quinn Ranch became known throughout the region for producing quality animals. Preston hired more help as the operation expanded, men he trusted to uphold the standards he had set. Catherine had her hands full managing the household and raising 4 active children, but she also found time to establish a small school in their home for the ranch children and those from neighboring spreads. She had always loved learning and teaching, and now she had the opportunity to pass that love on to the next generation. The school started with just her own children and 2 others, but within a few years, she was teaching nearly a dozen students of various ages. In 1898, Catherine discovered she was pregnant again at age 35. It was a surprise, as they had assumed their family was complete with 4 children. But surprises could be blessings too, and they welcomed the news even as Catherine worried about the physical demands of pregnancy at her age. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones. Catherine was exhausted all the time, and there were complications that concerned the doctor. Preston tried to take on more of the household duties, but he was already stretched thin with ranch responsibilities. They hired a young woman from town to help with the children and cooking, which eased some of the burden. Their 5th child, another son they named Thomas, was born in March of 1899. The birth was difficult, and the doctor warned them that Catherine should not have any more children. It was a sobering conversation, but Preston and Catherine agreed that 5 children was more than enough. They felt blessed by each one. Thomas was a quiet baby, easier than the others had been. He seemed content to watch the world from Catherine's arms, observing everything with serious dark eyes. Peter was 15 by then, old enough to be genuinely helpful with the younger children. He would hold Thomas while Catherine rested, walking him around the house or sitting on the porch with his baby brother sleeping against his shoulder. The new century arrived, bringing with it a sense of change and possibility. Preston was 40 years old, Catherine was 36, and they had been married for 17 years. The ranch was thriving, their children were healthy, and they had built the life they dreamed of during those first uncertain days. Preston still remembered the feeling of receiving Catherine's letter, the mix of hope and fear it had inspired. He remembered the desperate 3-day ride, pushing himself and his horse to the limit because he could not bear to miss his chance with her. Sometimes, when the weight of responsibility felt heavy or the challenges of ranch life seemed overwhelming, he would think back to that ride and remember what it had all been for. On a warm evening in June of 1900, Preston and Katherine sat together on their porch after the children had gone to bed. The valley spread out before them, peaceful in the twilight. This was their land now, bought and paid for through years of hard work. Their home, their legacy to pass on to their children. "You ever wonder how different our lives would be if I had not written that letter?" Katherine asked quietly. "All the time," Preston admitted. "I think about what I would have missed. You, the children, this life we built. It does not bear thinking about for long. I was so scared when I wrote it. Scared of being rejected, scared of looking foolish. But I was more scared of never knowing, of always wondering what might have been." Preston took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I am glad you were brave enough to write it, and I am glad I was crazy enough to ride 3 days just to read it." "We were both a little crazy," Katherine said with a smile. "But it worked out well, do you not think?" "Better than I ever imagined," Preston said. He looked at his wife, seeing both the young woman who had written that letter and the mature woman she had become. The years had left their mark, lines around her eyes, silver threading through her dark hair, the effects of bearing 5 children. But she was still beautiful to him, still the person he wanted beside him every day. "I love you," he said simply. "I do not say it enough, but I do. I have loved you since that day I fixed your wagon wheel, and I will love you until the day I die." Katherine's eyes were bright with tears. "And I love you, Preston Quinn. Thank you for riding those 3 days. Thank you for building this life with me." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear overhead. The ranch was quiet, the horses settled in their corrals, the children sleeping peacefully in their beds. It was an ordinary evening in an extraordinary life, built from a letter and a leap of faith. The years continued to unfold. Peter married a girl from a neighboring ranch in 1903 and built a house on the Quinn property. He took over much of the day-to-day management of the horses, showing the same skill and dedication his father had. Mary went away to a teaching college in Portland and came back to establish her own school in Jordan Valley. Samuel developed an interest in cattle ranching and eventually started his own operation on land adjacent to the Quinn Ranch. Anna showed signs of following her mother's path, loving books and learning. Thomas, the youngest, grew into a gentle boy who had a way with animals that surprised everyone. Preston and Katherine became grandparents in 1904 when Peter and his wife had a son. More grandchildren followed over the years, filling the ranch with another generation. Preston taught them to ride and work with horses, passing on skills that had sustained him through his life. Katherine read to them, told them stories, taught them their letters and numbers in her kitchen school. In 1910, Mr. Reynolds passed away in Portland. He was 83 years old and had lived to see his daughter build a thriving life and family. Preston and Katherine made the journey for his funeral, bringing all the children who were old enough to travel. As they stood beside her parents' graves, Katherine felt the weight of a generation passing, but also gratitude for the foundation they had given her. Preston was 51 that year, still strong and active, but beginning to feel the effects of decades of hard physical work. His hands ached on cold mornings, and his back protested after long days in the saddle. But he was content in a way he had never imagined possible when he was a young cowboy riding the range alone. The world was changing rapidly. Automobiles were becoming more common, even in rural areas like Jordan Valley. Electricity was spreading, though it had not yet reached their remote location. The old ways of the West were fading, replaced by modern conveniences and new industries. But on the Quinn Ranch, life continued much as it always had, governed by seasons and weather, by the needs of animals and land, by the rhythms of family. In 1913, on their 30th anniversary, Preston and Katherine gathered all their children and grandchildren for a celebration. There were 18 people around the table that evening, 3 generations of the family they had started with a letter and a ride. Preston looked around at the faces, seeing his own features reflected in his sons, Katherine's eyes in their daughters, and a mix of both in their grandchildren. "I want to say something," he announced when the meal was finished. The table quieted, everyone turning their attention to him. Preston was not given to speeches, so this was unusual. 30 years ago today, I married the bravest woman I have ever known," Preston began. "She had written me a letter, and I had ridden 3 days just to read it, just to see her, just to find out if what I felt was real. It was real. More real than anything else in my life." He looked at Katherine, who was smiling with tears in her eyes. "We have built this life together, through hard times and good times, through struggles and triumphs. Every good thing I have came from the choice we made to take a chance on each other." Preston turned to look at his children. "I want you all to know this story, to remember it. Your mother took a chance on writing that letter. I took a chance on dropping everything to come find her. We took a chance on getting married after barely knowing each other. Were we crazy? Maybe. But sometimes the best things in life require a little bit of crazy. Do not be afraid to take chances on the people and things that matter," Preston continued. "Do not let fear or practicality talk you out of pursuing what your heart wants. Your mother and I could have been sensible. She could have gone to Portland with her parents. I could have stayed at my job and let her go. But we chose each other instead, and that made all the difference." There was not a dry eye at the table by the time he finished. Katherine stood and came to his side, and he wrapped his arm around her waist. Their children and grandchildren raised glasses in a toast to 30 years of marriage, 30 years of building a life together, 30 years that had started with a letter left at the post office in Jordan Valley. The years after that were gentler. Preston gradually handed over more responsibility to Peter and Samuel, though he still rode out most days to check on things. Katherine closed her kitchen school when the county finally built a proper schoolhouse in town, but she continued tutoring children who needed extra help. They spent more time with their grandchildren, delighting in watching the next generation grow. In 1920, Preston and Katherine celebrated their 37th anniversary quietly, just the two of them. Their children were all grown and settled in their own lives. The ranch continued to thrive under Peter's management. Preston was 61, Katherine was 57, and they were entering the peaceful season of their lives. "You have any regrets?" Preston asked Katherine as they sat on their porch, a nightly ritual they had maintained for decades. Katherine was quiet for a moment, considering. "Small ones, maybe. Things I wish I had done differently with the children, times I could have been more patient or more understanding, but nothing big, nothing that changes the overall shape of my life. What about you?" "The same. Small regrets, but nothing that matters in the grand scheme. Mostly I am just grateful." "For what?" "For everything. For you, for our children, for this place we built. For the fact that you wrote that letter and I was brave enough or foolish enough to ride 3 days to read it. That one decision, that one moment of courage from both of us, led to all of this." Preston gestured at the ranch spread out before them, the house full of memories, the life they had created. "It was a good letter," Katherine said with a smile. "It was the best letter," Preston replied. Changed my whole life." They sat together as the sun set over the valley, two people who had bet everything on love and won. The ranch would continue after them, passed down to their children and grandchildren. The letter Katherine had written was tucked away in a safe place, yellowed and fragile now, but preserved as a family treasure. And the story of the cowboy who rode 3 days just to read it would be told and retold for generations. A reminder that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single act of courage. Preston died peacefully in 1927, surrounded by family, at the age of 68. He had lived to see his ranch prosper, his children succeed, and his grandchildren begin having children of their own. His last words were to Katherine, the same words he had said to her countless times over their 44 years of marriage. "I love you." Katherine lived another 8 years without him, though she grieved his loss deeply. She spent her final years writing in journals, recording the family history and stories for future generations. She documented not just the big events but the small moments that made up a life. The first time each child walked, Preston's habit of bringing her wildflowers from the range, the sound of rain on their roof, the feeling of his hand in hers. When Katherine died in 1935 at age 72, she was laid to rest beside Preston in the Jordan Valley Cemetery, not far from where her parents were also buried. Their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren gathered for the funeral, a testament to the legacy they had built together. The ranch continued through the generations, each adding their own chapter to the story. Peter's son took it over, then his grandson. The original letter, carefully preserved and now kept in a glass frame, hung in the ranch house as a reminder of where it all began. Visitors would ask about it, and whoever was telling the story that day would explain. She left a letter for the cowboy at the post, and he rode 3 days just to read it, and that is how our family began. The letter itself was simple, the words Katherine had struggled over so carefully now familiar to everyone in the family. "Dear Preston, I hope this letter finds you well. I have been thinking about our conversation when you helped my family with our broken wagon, and I wanted to reach out to you. I found our time together to be the brightest part of my summer, and I have thought of you often since then. I do not know if you remember me or our conversation as fondly as I do, but I had to take the chance to find out. My family will be moving to Portland soon, and I could not leave without knowing if you felt even a fraction of what I felt. If you do, if there is any possibility that you might, I would very much like to see you again before I leave. If not, I understand and I wish you all the best in your life and work. With hope and affection, Katherine Reynolds." It was not a grand declaration or a perfectly crafted piece of literature, but it was honest and brave, and it had been enough. Enough to bring a cowboy riding 3 days through rough country. Enough to start a conversation that led to a proposal. Enough to build a marriage that lasted 44 years and produced 5 children, countless grandchildren, and a legacy that would endure for generations. The ranch house still stood, modified and expanded over the decades, but recognizably the same place where Preston and Katherine had raised their family. The corrals where Preston had trained horses were still in use. The garden where Katherine had grown vegetables was still producing food. The land they had worked so hard to secure was still in family hands, still productive, still home. And sometimes, when the wind blew just right through the valley, people would swear they could hear echoes of laughter from long ago. Children playing in the yard. Katherine calling them in for supper. Preston's voice as he worked with the horses. The sounds of a life well lived, a love well earned, all because a young woman had been brave enough to write a letter, and a young man had been crazy enough to ride 3 days just to read it. That was how it began, with paper and ink and hope. And that was how it endured in the stories passed down. The land still worked, the family still growing. A legacy built not on grand gestures or dramatic moments, but on two people choosing each other again and again, day after day, for the rest of their lives. The sun set over the Quinn ranch as it had for decades, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. The land was quiet, peaceful, waiting for the next chapter to be written. But the foundation was solid, built on love and courage and a 3-day ride that changed everything. And that foundation would last forever, a testament to the power of taking a chance on love, no matter how impractical or crazy it might seem.